The December wind cut through Sarah Winchester's thin shawl like 1,000 knives as she stood outside the Salt Lake City hotel, her breath forming small clouds in the frozen air that disappeared as quickly as her hopes seemed to be fading. She had been waiting for 3 hours now, watching every horse that came down the snow-dusted Main Street, praying that one of them would carry James Hartley, the man who had promised to meet her here at 6 o'clock sharp to take her to his family's ranch where they would finally be married after 6 months of courtship through letters and one brief meeting in Denver. The temperature had dropped considerably since the sun disappeared behind the Wasatch Mountains, and her fingers had gone numb inside her worn gloves. But still she waited, because she had nowhere else to go and no one else in this world who had promised to care for her. Sarah had traveled all the way from Missouri, spending the last of her deceased mother's savings on the train ticket and a new dress for the wedding, leaving behind the only home she had ever known because James had written such beautiful letters about Utah Territory and the life they would build together. Her mother had died in September from consumption, and her father had passed 5 years before that in a mining accident, leaving Sarah alone in a world that offered few options for a 22-year-old woman with no family and no fortune. James had seemed like an answer to prayers she had barely dared to whisper, a kind voice in the darkness, a promise of safety and belonging in a life that had offered precious little of either. But now, as the church bells struck 9 and the streets grew quieter, Sarah felt the cold settling not just into her bones but into her heart. She had checked at the hotel desk 4 times already, and each time the clerk had shaken his head with increasing impatience, telling her that no messages had arrived and that she could not stand in the lobby unless she paid for a room. The $5 in her reticule was all she had left in the world, and she had been saving it for emergencies, though she was beginning to realize that this might qualify as exactly that kind of situation. The streets of Salt Lake City stretched out before her in the darkness, lit by occasional lanterns hanging outside saloons and shops. She could hear piano music drifting from somewhere nearby, and the sound of men's laughter, and the lonely whistle of a late train pulling into the station. She thought about going back to the train station, but there was no point because she had no money for a ticket and nowhere to return to even if she did. The little house in Missouri had been sold to pay her mother's debts, and all of Sarah's possessions now fit into the single carpet bag sitting at her feet. She was just beginning to consider whether she might be able to sleep in the hotel's stable when she heard boots crunching in the snow behind her. Sarah turned quickly, hope flaring briefly in her chest, but the man walking toward her was not James. This man was taller, broader in the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He walked with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape, someone who had never felt lost or alone or foolish enough to travel 1,000 miles for a man who might not even exist. "Evening, miss," the man said, touching the brim of his hat as he came closer. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling in a stream, but there was something gentle in it too. "I do not mean to intrude, but I have noticed you standing out here for quite some time now. Are you waiting for someone?" Sarah wanted to say yes, wanted to maintain some dignity, but the concern in his voice broke something loose inside her. "I was," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I do not think he is coming." The man moved closer, and in the light spilling from the hotel window, Sarah could see his face more clearly. He had strong features, weathered by sun and wind, with dark eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and sorrow. A scar ran along his left cheekbone, pale against his tanned skin, and his dark hair was just long enough to curl slightly at his collar. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, and there was something solid about him, something that made Sarah feel slightly less adrift in the frozen night. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked, glancing at the carpetbag at her feet. "Since 6, Sarah said. He was supposed to meet me here. We were going to be married." The man's expression darkened. "And he just left you standing here in the cold for 3 hours. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I suppose he changed his mind. Or maybe he never meant to come at all. I do not know any more." The man was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made Sarah want to look away. Then he shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out to her. "Here," he said. "You are freezing." "I cannot take your coat," Sarah protested, even though she was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. "You will be cold." "I have been cold before," the man said simply. "And I have another coat at home. Please take it." There was something in his tone that left no room for argument, and Sarah was too cold and too tired to fight anymore. She let him drape the coat around her shoulders, and the warmth of it was so immediate and so comforting that she almost started crying right there on the street. The coat smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something else she could not quite name, something that felt like safety. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name is Thomas Novak," the man said. "I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. I came into town to pick up supplies, and I was just about to head back when I saw you standing here." "Sarah Winchester," she replied, pulling his coat tighter around herself. "I came from Missouri." "That is a long way to travel," Thomas said quietly. "Do you have anywhere to stay tonight?" "Any friends or family in town?" Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. Thomas was silent for another moment, and Sarah could see him weighing something in his mind. Then he said, "I have a housekeeper named Mrs. Chen who lives at the ranch. She is a widow from San Francisco, and she keeps a spare room ready for guests. You are welcome to come back with me tonight, get warm, have a hot meal. In the morning, when your head is clearer, you can decide what you want to do next." Sarah stared at him, uncertain whether to be grateful or suspicious. "You are inviting me to your ranch. You do not even know me." "No," Thomas agreed, "but I know what it is like to be alone and far from home. And I know that no decent man leaves a woman standing in the cold on a December night when he has the means to help." He paused, then added, "Mrs. Chen will be there, so you need not worry about propriety. She is a fierce protector of anyone I bring home, and she will make sure you are comfortable and safe." Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception or ill intent, but all she saw was honest concern. She was out of options and nearly out of hope, and something about Thomas Novak made her want to trust him even though every sensible part of her brain was screaming that she should not go anywhere with a stranger. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Thomas smiled for the first time, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. "Because someone helped me once, when I needed it most. And because no woman should have to spend the night in the cold because some fool was too cowardly to keep his promises." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, some small piece of the ice that had been forming around her heart beginning to thaw. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you. I would be grateful for a warm place to stay tonight." Thomas picked up her carpetbag as easily as if it weighed nothing at all and gestured down the street. "My wagon is just over here. The ride will take about an hour, but I have plenty of blankets, and the horses know the way even in the dark." As they walked together through the snowy streets, Sarah found herself studying Thomas from the corner of her eye. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, nodding to people they passed, clearly well known and respected in town. Several people called out greetings, and an older woman standing outside a general store gave Sarah a curious but not unfriendly look. The wagon was loaded with supplies, sacks of flour and sugar, crates of canned goods, coils of rope, and various tools. Thomas helped Sarah up onto the seat, then arranged several thick wool blankets around her before climbing up himself and taking the reins. The two horses, a matched pair of sturdy bays, started forward without any urging, their breath steaming in the cold air. As they left the lights of Salt Lake City behind and headed north into the darkness, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, despite everything that had happened. The coat around her shoulders was warm, the blankets were warmer still, and Thomas Novak sat beside her like a solid presence in a world that had felt dangerously unstable for far too long. "Tell me about your ranch," she said after a while, partly because she was genuinely curious and partly because the silence felt too heavy. Thomas glanced at her, seeming surprised by the question. "It is not much," he said. "About 500 acres, mostly for cattle. I have been building it up for the past 8 years, since I came back from the war. It was my father's place originally, but he died while I was away fighting, and my mother followed him a year later. So it is just me now, and Mrs. Chen, and 4 ranch hands who help with the cattle and horses." "I am sorry about your parents," Sarah said softly. "Thank you," Thomas replied. "It was a long time ago now, but I still miss them, especially this time of year. My mother loved Christmas, used to decorate the whole house with pine boughs and candles. Mrs. Chen does her best to keep up the tradition, but it is not quite the same." Sarah heard the loneliness in his voice and recognized it because it matched her own. "I lost both my parents too," she said. "My father died in a mining accident when I was 17, and my mother passed away in September. It was the consumption. She fought it for a long time, but in the end it took her anyway." "And that is why you came to Utah?" Thomas asked gently. "Because you had no one left." "That is part of it," Sarah admitted. "But also because James seemed kind, and I thought maybe I could build a new life here. I thought maybe I would not have to be alone anymore." She laughed bitterly. "I suppose that was foolish of me." "It was not foolish," Thomas said firmly. "It was hopeful, and there is nothing wrong with hope. The man was a fool for not meeting you, but that says nothing about you and everything about him." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon creaking rhythmically, the horses' hooves making soft thuds in the snow-covered road. The moon had risen, nearly full, and it cast a silver light over the landscape, illuminating the mountains in the distance and the vast stretches of sage and grassland between. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, and Sarah found herself understanding why people came here, why they stayed despite the harshness and the isolation. "What did you do in Missouri?" Thomas asked after a while. "I was a school teacher," Sarah said, and she heard the wistfulness in her own voice. "I loved it. The children, the books, the feeling of helping young minds grow. But after my mother died, the school board said they needed someone who could commit for the long term, and with my mother's debts, I had to sell the house. I did not have anywhere to stay, so I could not keep the position." "You could teach here," Thomas said. "Salt Lake City is always looking for good teachers, and there are several smaller towns nearby that need schools." Sarah considered this. "Perhaps," she said, "if I decide to stay." "Where else would you go?" Thomas asked, and there was no judgment in the question, only curiosity. "I do not know," Sarah admitted. "I have not thought that far ahead yet. Today was supposed to be the beginning of my new life, and now I do not know what comes next." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to say that, when we think we have reached the end of our story, that is usually when the next chapter is about to begin. We just cannot see it yet because we are too close to the pain." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Sarah said. "She was," Thomas agreed. wise and kind and strong. She had to be, raising a family out here. The land can be unforgiving, and life does not always turn out the way we plan. But she never gave up, never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes again, but this time they were not entirely tears of sadness. There was something else mixed in, something that felt almost like gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the coat and the ride and the kindness. You did not have to help me, but you did, and I will not forget that." "You do not need to thank me," Thomas said. "Just promise me you will not give up on yourself. You came all this way, survived losing everyone you loved, and you are still standing." "That takes courage, Miss Winchester. More courage than most people ever have to find." Before Sarah could respond, they crested a hill, and she saw lights in the distance. "Is that your ranch?" she asked. "That is home," Thomas confirmed, and there was warmth in his voice that had not been there before. "The house is not fancy, but it is solid and warm, and Mrs. Chen will probably have soup on the stove even at this hour. She seems to have a sixth sense about when people need feeding." As they drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. The ranch house was a large, two-story structure built of wood and stone, with a wide porch running along the front and smoke curling from two chimneys. There were several outbuildings nearby, including a large barn, a stable, and what looked like a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Lamplight glowed in several windows, giving the whole place a welcoming appearance that made Sarah's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Thomas pulled the wagon up in front of the house and helped Sarah down, steadying her when she stumbled slightly on stiff legs. The front door opened before they reached it, and a small, fierce-looking Chinese woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thomas Novak, where have you been?" she demanded in English that carried only the faintest trace of an accent. "You said you would be back before dark, and here it is nearly 10 o'clock. Then her sharp eyes landed on Sarah, and her expression changed from irritation to concern. "And who is this?" "What has happened?" "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Sarah Winchester," Thomas said. "She needs a place to stay tonight. I will explain everything, but first, let us get her inside where it is warm." Mrs. Chen immediately stepped aside, ushering Sarah into the house with surprising gentleness. The interior was just as welcoming as the exterior had promised, with warm wood floors, comfortable furniture, and a fire crackling in a large stone fireplace. The smell of soup and fresh bread filled the air, making Sarah's stomach growl despite her emotional turmoil. Sit, Mrs. Chen commanded, steering Sarah toward a chair near the fire. "You are frozen through. Thomas, get her some tea, and there is stew on the stove. This poor girl looks like she has not eaten in days." "I ate this morning," Sarah protested weakly, but Mrs. Chen was already bustling off toward what Sarah assumed was the kitchen. Thomas hung his hat on a peg by the door and went to help Mrs. Chen, leaving Sarah alone for a moment to look around. The room was clearly the work of people who valued comfort over ostentation. There were books on shelves, well-worn quilts draped over the backs of chairs, and photographs on the mantel showing people Sarah assumed were Thomas's family. One photo showed a serious-looking man and a smiling woman with Thomas's eyes, clearly his parents. Another showed a younger Thomas in a military uniform, looking both proud and haunted. Thomas returned with a steaming mug of tea, which Sarah accepted gratefully. The warmth of it spread through her hands and then her body, and she felt herself beginning to relax for the first time in hours. "Thank you," she said again, knowing the words were inadequate but not having anything better to offer. Mrs. Chen appeared with a bowl of stew and a thick slice of bread, which she set on a small table beside Sarah's chair. "Eat," she ordered. "Then you can tell us what brings you to our home in the middle of the night." The stew was delicious, rich with beef and vegetables and herbs, and Sarah ate more quickly than was probably polite, suddenly ravenous. Thomas settled into a chair across from her, and Mrs. Chen perched on the edge of the sofa, both of them waiting patiently until Sarah had finished eating. When she finally set down her empty bowl, Sarah took a deep breath and told them the whole story. She explained about James's letters, about her mother's death, about the journey from Missouri and the long wait in the cold. She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to maintain some dignity, but by the end, she was crying despite her best efforts. Mrs. Chen made a disgusted sound. "Men," she said flatly. "Some of them are worth less than pig droppings. You are better off without this James person, whoever he is." "But I have nowhere to go," Sarah said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I spent almost all my money getting here, and I have no family, no job, no prospects." "You have a place here," Thomas said quietly, and both women turned to look at him in surprise. "For as long as you need it. The spare room is yours, and you can help Mrs. Chen around the house if you want to feel useful. Or you can take some time to rest and figure out what you want to do next. There is no pressure, no expectations. Just a safe place to stay until you land on your feet." Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed. "I cannot possibly accept that. I would be a burden, and you barely know me." "You would not be a burden," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "I have been telling Thomas for years that this house needs a woman's touch. He is a good man, but he has the decorating sense of a barn owl, and there is always work to be done on a ranch. If you want to help, there will be plenty for you to do. If you want to rest, that is fine too." "But why?" Sarah asked, looking between them. "Why would you help me like this? What do you want in return?" Thomas leaned forward, his dark eyes serious. "I want nothing in return except to know that you are safe and well. Miss Winchester, I know what it is like to come home from a war to find everything you knew is gone. I know what it is like to feel lost and alone and uncertain about the future. And I know how much it meant when people helped me get back on my feet. This is just me paying that kindness forward." Sarah felt something crack open inside her, some tightly held control that had been keeping her upright finally giving way. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, all the fear and disappointment and grief of the past months pouring out in great, wrenching gasps. She felt Mrs. Chen's small hand patting her shoulder, heard Thomas's quiet voice murmuring something comforting, and she let herself fall apart because there was nothing else left to do. When the storm finally passed, Sarah felt exhausted but also somehow lighter. She accepted the handkerchief Thomas offered and wiped her face, feeling embarrassed but also strangely relieved. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Never apologize for honest tears," Mrs. Chen said briskly. "Now come, I will show you to your room. You need sleep, and tomorrow we will figure out everything else." Sarah followed Mrs. Chen up a staircase to the second floor, where the housekeeper opened a door to reveal a cozy bedroom with a large bed, a dresser, a wardrobe, and a window that would probably offer a beautiful view in the daylight. There was a quilt on the bed in a pattern of stars and a rag rug on the floor, and someone had already lit a fire in the small fireplace to take the chill off the air. "The washroom is just down the hall," Mrs. Chen said. "There is water in the pitcher, and if you need anything else, my room is at the end of the hall and Thomas's is downstairs off the kitchen. Do not hesitate to call if you need something." "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it with her whole heart. "I do not know how I will ever repay your kindness." Mrs. Chen smiled, and it transformed her stern face into something warm and almost motherly. "You can repay it by giving yourself a chance to heal and find joy again. That is all any of us can do in this hard world." She patted Sarah's hand. "Sleep well, child. Tomorrow is a new day. after Mrs. Chen left, Sarah changed into her nightgown and climbed into the bed, which was more comfortable than anything she had slept in for months. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch house settling around her, and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning, she had been full of hope and nervous excitement, preparing to meet the man she thought she would marry. Tonight she was in a stranger's home, wearing a stranger's coat that still hung on the back of the chair where she had placed it, being offered kindness by people who had no reason to care about her at all. Sarah thought about James, about the life she had imagined with him, and realized that she felt more relief than regret. If he had been the kind of man who could leave her waiting in the cold, then perhaps she was better off discovering that now rather than after she had married him. And Thomas Novak, with his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness, had shown her more consideration in 3 hours than James had in 6 months of letters. She fell asleep thinking about Thomas's dark eyes and the way he had smiled at her, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel quite so alone. Sarah woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from downstairs. For a moment she was disoriented, not remembering where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. She had accepted the hospitality of strangers. She was in the home of a man she had only just met. What had she been thinking? But then she remembered the cold, and Thomas's coat, and the genuine concern in his voice, and she felt herself relaxing slightly. She had made the best decision she could with the information and options she had. Now she just needed to figure out what came next. Sarah washed her face in the basin, dressed in one of her simple day dresses, and pinned up her hair as best she could without a proper mirror. Then she made her way downstairs, following the sounds and smells of breakfast. Mrs. Chen was at the stove, and Thomas was sitting at a large wooden table, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. He looked up when Sarah entered, and his face brightened in a way that made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. "Good morning," he said, standing politely. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "Sit, eat," Mrs. Chen commanded, placing a plate heaped with eggs, bacon, and biscuits in front of the empty chair. "You are too thin. We need to put some meat on your bones." Sarah sat and ate, trying not to feel self-conscious about the way Thomas kept glancing at her over his newspaper. The food was delicious, and she found herself eating more than she usually did at breakfast, the events of the previous day having apparently left her ravenous. "I was thinking," Thomas said after a while, folding up his paper. "If you are interested, you could come out with me this morning and see the ranch. Get a sense of the place, meet the hands. No pressure, but you might enjoy getting out in the fresh air." Sarah considered this. Part of her wanted to hide in her room and avoid facing the reality of her situation, but another part was curious about this place and the man who had rescued her. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you." After breakfast, Thomas lent Sarah a warmer coat that had belonged to his mother and led her outside. In the daylight, the ranch was even more impressive than it had seemed the night before. The mountains rose up in the distance, their peaks white with snow, and the land stretched out in all directions, vast and open and beautiful in a way that made Sarah's breath catch. Thomas showed her the barn, where several horses nickered in greeting, and introduced her to the ranch hands who were already hard at work despite the early hour. There was a young man named Billy, probably not more than 20, with red hair and an easy smile. There was a Mexican man named Rodrigo who was probably in his 40s, with weathered hands and kind eyes. There was an older man named Frank who nodded at Sarah, but did not say much. And there was a black man named Moses who had fought in the same regiment as Thomas during the war and now worked as the ranch's foreman. All of them treated Sarah with respect and curiosity, but not suspicion, which suggested that Thomas had already explained her presence. She appreciated that he had not made a big deal of it, had not forced her to explain herself over and over again. As they walked around the property, Thomas told her about the ranch's operations, about the cattle they raised and the horses they bred, about the challenges of running a spread this size with only a handful of men. He talked about his plans for the future, about wanting to expand gradually and sustainably, about building something that would last. My father used to say that land is the only thing in this world that is real, Thomas said as they stood looking out over a field where cattle grazed peacefully. Everything else can be taken from you, but land endures. I did not understand what he meant until after I came back from the war and found this place still here, still standing, even though everyone I loved was gone. Sarah heard the pain in his voice and felt an answering ache in her own chest. "It must have been hard," she said softly, "coming home to an empty house." "It was the hardest thing I have ever done," Thomas admitted. "Harder than any battle, harder than any wound. But I had to do it because the alternative was giving up, and I had made a promise to my parents that I would take care of their legacy." They walked in silence for a while, and Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the morning, into the simple pleasure of being outside in the crisp December air with the sun on her face. She realized that she had not felt this peaceful in a very long time, maybe not since before her father died. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Of course. Why did you really help me last night?" "You said it was because someone helped you once, but I feel like there is more to it than that." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "You are right," he said finally. "There is more to it. The truth is, when I saw you standing there in the cold, waiting for someone who was not coming, it reminded me of my mother. She spent years waiting for my father to come home from various trips, always standing by the window, always watching the road. And when I was away at war, I thought about her doing that, waiting for me, and I promised myself that if I made it home, I would never let anyone wait like that if I could help it." He turned to look at Sarah, and his eyes were intense. "I know that probably sounds foolish, but when I saw you there, it felt like fate was giving me a chance to keep that promise." Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes again. "That does not sound foolish at all," she whispered. "That sounds like the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and Sarah felt something shift between them, some connection forming that felt both fragile and incredibly strong. She barely knew this man, but already she felt safer with him than she had with James after months of correspondence. "I should probably tell you something," Sarah said, breaking the moment. "I have no idea how long I will be able to stay here. I need to find work, need to figure out how to support myself. I cannot just be your charity case forever." "You are not a charity case," Thomas said firmly. "You are a guest, and guests are always welcome to stay as long as they need to. But if you want to work, I am sure we can find something for you to do. Mrs. Chen could probably use help with the cooking and cleaning, and there is always mending to be done, and if you want to teach, I am sure we could arrange something with the children in town." "You would do that for me?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Of course," Thomas said simply. "Why would I not?" Sarah did not have an answer for that, so she just smiled and let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe things were going to be all right after all. Over the next few weeks, Sarah settled into life at the ranch with surprising ease. She helped Mrs. Chen with the cooking and cleaning, discovering that she enjoyed the simple, meditative work of kneading bread and scrubbing floors. She mended clothes for the ranch hands, who were all grateful to have someone fix the tears and worn patches in their shirts and trousers. She read books from Thomas's extensive library, losing herself in stories of adventure and romance in far-off places. And she spent time with Thomas, long hours of quiet companionship that felt more natural than anything Sarah had experienced before. They talked about everything and nothing, about their childhoods and their losses, about their dreams for the future and their fears about the present. Thomas told her about the war, about the things he had seen and done that still haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. Sarah told him about her parents, about the loneliness of watching her mother slowly fade away, about the terror of being alone in the world with no one to turn to. They did not speak about James again. It was as if he had never existed, as if that whole chapter of Sarah's life had been nothing but a bad dream. The only reminder was the new dress still packed in Sarah's carpet bag, the dress she had bought for a wedding that would never happen. Christmas came, and Mrs. Chen decorated the house with pine boughs and candles, just as Thomas's mother had done, and they all celebrated together with a feast that included the ranch hands and even a few neighbors from the nearby properties. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in years, feeling welcomed and valued in a way she had not felt since before her father died. On Christmas night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire, drinking hot cider and watching the flames dance. "Thank you for this," Sarah said softly, "for all of it. You have given me something I did not think I would ever have again." "What is that?" Thomas asked. "A home," Sarah said simply. "A place where I belong." Thomas looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's heart race. "You do belong here," he said. "I hope you know that. I hope you know that you can stay for as long as you want, forever, if that is what you choose." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Thomas, I cannot just live here forever as your guest. People will talk. It is not proper." "Then do not be my guest," Thomas said, his voice low and intense. "Be something more. Be my partner. Be my wife." Sarah stared at him, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. "What?" Thomas set down his cider and took Sarah's hands in his. "I know it is too soon. I know we have only known each other for a few weeks. But Sarah, I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are kind and strong and brave, and when you smile, it feels like the sun coming out after a long winter. I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated. I just want you to know that I care for you deeply, and that I would be honored if you would consider making this your home permanently." Sarah's mind was racing. This was too fast, too sudden. She had only just escaped one proposal of marriage that had gone disastrously wrong. How could she possibly consider another one so soon? But even as those thoughts ran through her head, another part of her was whispering that this was different. Thomas was different. He had not courted her with pretty words on paper. He had shown her who he was through his actions, through his kindness and his generosity and his quiet strength. She knew him in a way she had never known James, knew him in her bones and in her heart. "I care for you too," Sarah admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "More than I thought possible in such a short time. But Thomas, I am scared. What if I am making another mistake? What if this is just as much of a disaster as James was?" "It will not be," Thomas said firmly. "I promise you that. I will never leave you waiting in the cold. I will never break a promise to you. I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you know that you are loved and valued and cherished." Sarah felt tears running down her face, but this time they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief and joy and the overwhelming sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and Sarah felt herself melting into his embrace, feeling safe and loved and finally home. They sat there by the fire for a long time, holding each other, not needing words because everything important had already been said. They were married in February, in a simple ceremony at the Salt Lake City church with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands as witnesses. Sarah wore the dress she had bought for James, and instead of feeling sad about it, she felt grateful because it meant something beautiful had come from that pain after all. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, as Sarah learned the rhythms of Thomas's life and he learned hers. There were awkward moments and misunderstandings, times when they had to work to communicate what they needed and wanted. But through it all, there was love and respect and a commitment to building something lasting together. Sarah started teaching in Salt Lake City 3 days a week, working with children whose families could not afford the regular school fees. Thomas supported her fully, helping her prepare lessons in the evenings and always asking about her students with genuine interest. She loved the work, loved feeling useful and valued in a way that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's careful management, and Sarah found herself becoming more involved in the business side of things, helping with the accounts and the correspondence with buyers. She had a head for numbers that surprised both of them, and Thomas started relying on her judgment more and more when it came to financial decisions. Moses became a close friend, often joining Sarah and Thomas for dinner and sharing stories about his own experiences during the war and after. He had been born into slavery in Virginia, had escaped to join the Union Army, and had drifted west after the war looking for a place where he could build a life on his own terms. Thomas had hired him almost immediately, recognizing a kindred spirit, and Moses had proven to be the best foreman the ranch had ever had. Mrs. Chen remained a constant presence, always ready with tea and advice, and the occasional sharp observation about human nature. She taught Sarah how to cook Chinese dishes that Thomas had come to love, and Sarah taught her some of the recipes from Missouri that her mother had passed down. They became friends despite the difference in their ages and backgrounds, united by their love for Thomas and their determination to make the ranch a true home. In May, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with both joy and terror, remembering her own mother's difficult pregnancies and the baby brother who had been stillborn when Sarah was 12. But Thomas was thrilled, and Mrs. Chen was ecstatic, immediately taking over Sarah's heavier chores and insisting she rest more. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Sarah was often tired and sick in the early months. Thomas was incredibly patient, bringing her tea and toast when she could not face a full breakfast, rubbing her feet in the evenings when they ached, reading to her from her favorite books when she was too exhausted to do anything but lie still. "I am sorry I am so useless," Sarah said one evening in June, feeling frustrated with her own weakness. "You are creating a human life inside your body," Thomas said, looking at her with wonder. "That is the opposite of useless. That is the most important work anyone could possibly do." Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes again, hormones making her more emotional than usual. "What if I am not a good mother? What if I do not know how to take care of a baby?" "Then you will learn," Thomas said simply. "Just like you learned how to run a ranch and teach school and be married to a stubborn cowboy. You are the strongest, most capable person I know, Sarah. You will be an amazing mother." Their son was born in January, during a snowstorm that left them trapped at the ranch for 3 days. Mrs. Chen served as midwife, having delivered countless babies in San Francisco, and Thomas held Sarah's hand through the long hours of labor, murmuring encouragement and love. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Sarah felt a rush of love so intense it almost frightened her. Thomas wept openly as he held his son for the first time, and Sarah knew that this was what it meant to be truly happy, to have everything you needed right here in your arms. They named him Thomas Nathaniel Novak, after his father and Thomas's father. Little Nathaniel, as they called him, was a good baby, content to be held and fed and loved. He had Thomas's dark eyes and Sarah's delicate features, and everyone who saw him agreed he was the most beautiful child ever born. The first year of Nathaniel's life was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Sarah learned how to nurse and change diapers and function on almost no sleep. Thomas learned how to soothe a crying baby and sing lullabies in his rough voice and do accounts one-handed while holding his son. Mrs. Chen doted on the baby shamelessly, spoiling him with attention and treats. As Nathaniel grew, Sarah found herself thinking often about the night she had stood outside that Salt Lake City hotel, waiting for a man who never came. She thought about how terrified and alone she had felt, how certain she had been that her life was over before it had really begun. And she thought about Thomas offering his coat and his home, about the kindness of strangers who had become family, about the way life could surprise you with joy when you least expected it. One evening in March, when Nathaniel was 14 months old and toddling around getting into everything, Thomas found Sarah standing by the window, looking out at the sunset painting the mountains gold and pink. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Sarah said, leaning back against him. "For you, for this life, for everything we have built together. I am thinking about how close I came to missing all of this because I was waiting for the wrong person." "I am grateful too," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every single day I wake up and cannot quite believe that you are here, that you chose me, that we have this beautiful life together." "It was not really a choice," Sarah said, turning in his arms to face him. "It was fate. It was meant to be. You were always the one I was waiting for. I just did not know it yet." Thomas kissed her, slow and sweet, and Sarah felt the familiar warmth spreading through her chest, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. Behind them, Nathaniel babbled happily to himself as he played with his wooden blocks, and through the window, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to their happiness. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow. A daughter named Sophie arrived 2 years after Nathaniel, with Sarah's blonde hair and Thomas's stubborn determination. Another son, Marcus, came 3 years after that, quiet and thoughtful even as a baby. The ranch prospered, expanding gradually as Thomas had always planned, becoming one of the most successful in the territory. Sarah continued teaching when she could, though after Marcus was born, she started holding lessons at the ranch instead of traveling to Salt Lake City. Children from neighboring properties would come twice a week for reading and arithmetic, and Sarah loved the chaos of having her house full of young voices and eager minds. Mrs. Chen remained with them until she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by the family she had helped build. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, where she could watch over the place she had loved so much. Sarah mourned her deeply, feeling like she had lost a second mother, but she took comfort in knowing that Mrs. Chen had lived her last years in happiness and peace. Moses eventually married a widow from town, a woman named Ruth who had 3 children of her own. They built a house on the edge of the ranch property, and their blended family became an extension of Sarah and Thomas's own. The children all grew up together, playing in the fields and learning to ride horses and getting into the kind of trouble that makes for good stories later in life. Billy eventually moved to California to seek his fortune in the gold fields, but he wrote regularly, and his letters were always full of wild adventures and close calls. Rodrigo stayed on the ranch until he was too old to work, and then he lived in a small cottage that Thomas had built specifically for retired hands, spending his days whittling and telling stories to the grandchildren. Frank died of a heart attack during a particularly hard winter, and they mourned him and then hired a young man fresh from Texas, who reminded Sarah of Billy with his red hair and easy smile. The territory became a state, and Sarah and Thomas watched Utah grow and change around them. New railroads brought more people, new towns sprang up like mushrooms after rain, and the wild, untamed land of Sarah's early years slowly transformed into something more civilized. She was not entirely sure how she felt about that, but Thomas reminded her that change was inevitable and that they could choose to embrace it or resist it, but they could not stop it. Sarah's students grew up and had children of their own, and some of them sent their children to learn from Mrs. Novak, as everyone called her now. She taught 3 generations of children to read and write and think critically, and she took pride in knowing that she had made a difference in their lives. Nathaniel grew into a serious young man who shared his father's love for the land and his mother's love for learning. He went to university in the East, studying agriculture and business, and then came home to help run the ranch with new ideas and modern methods. Sophie became a teacher like her mother, opening a school in Salt Lake City that accepted students of all backgrounds and economic situations. Marcus became a veterinarian, the first in the family to pursue such specialized education, and he traveled throughout the state caring for animals and teaching others how to do the same. Sarah and Thomas grew old together, their faces weathering with time, their bodies moving more slowly, but their love never diminishing. They still sat by the fire on winter evenings, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. They still walked the property together when the weather was fine, pointing out changes and remembering the past. They still looked at each other sometimes and felt that same flutter of attraction and affection that had drawn them together all those years ago. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Thomas gave Sarah a leather-bound journal. "What is this?" she asked, running her fingers over the soft cover. "It is for you to write down your story," Thomas said, "our story, so that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will know how we found each other, how we built this life together. So they will know that even when things seem hopeless, sometimes the right person is just around the corner, offering their coat and their home and their heart." Sarah felt tears welling up, though these days, everything seemed to make her cry. "That is beautiful, Thomas. Thank you." She started writing that very night, sitting at the desk in what had been the spare room and was now her private study. She wrote about Missouri and the train journey and the cold December night when she had waited for a man who never came. She wrote about Thomas appearing out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. She wrote about Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands and the slow, tentative building of a life she had not known she wanted. She wrote about fear and hope, about loss and love, about the way life can surprise you with joy when you have given up expecting it. She wrote about becoming a wife and mother, about teaching children and managing accounts and learning to rope cattle, even though she had never been very good at it. She wrote about the hard times, the winters when they had almost lost everything, the illness that took Sophie's first baby before he was even a year old, the arguments and misunderstandings that are part of any long marriage. But mostly, she wrote about love. The deep, abiding, everyday kind of love that gets you through the hard times and makes the good times better. The kind of love that is built on respect and friendship and shared work and shared joy. the kind of love that does not require grand gestures or dramatic declarations, because it is proven every day in 1,000 small ways. Sarah was 68 years old when Thomas died. It was sudden, a heart attack while he was out checking on the cattle with Nathaniel. He died quickly, with his son beside him and the mountains he loved stretching out in all directions, and Sarah took some small comfort in knowing that he had not suffered. But the loss was devastating nonetheless. For the first time since that December night so long ago, Sarah felt truly alone. She walked through the house they had shared for over 40 years, touching his things, smelling his coat that still hung by the door, and she wondered how she was supposed to go on without him. But then Sophie arrived with her children, and Nathaniel came with his family, and Marcus traveled back from his practice in the northern part of the state. They surrounded her with love and support, reminding her that she was not alone, that Thomas lived on in all of them. And slowly, painfully, Sarah learned to live in a world without Thomas. She continued writing in the journal he had given her because it felt like a way of staying connected to him. She continued teaching because the children needed her and she needed them. She continued running the ranch with Nathaniel's help because Thomas would have wanted that. She lived for another 12 years, long enough to see Nathaniel take over the ranch completely, long enough to see Sophie's school thrive and grow, long enough to see Marcus make significant contributions to veterinary medicine in the West. She lived long enough to hold 15 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren, and to know that the love she and Thomas had built would continue long after she was gone. On a cold December night, very much like the night she had first met Thomas, Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 80 years old, and she had lived a full, rich, beautiful life. The family buried her next to Thomas on the hill where Mrs. Chen rested, where they could all look out over the ranch that had been built from nothing but hard work and hope and love. At the funeral, Sophie read from the journal her mother had written, the story of a woman who had waited in the cold for a man who never came, and the cowboy who had offered his coat and his home and his heart. And years later, when the grandchildren and great-grandchildren asked about their ancestors, about the people who had built the ranch and the family that bore their name, someone would always take down the leather-bound journal and read the story of Sarah and Thomas, of a love that had started with kindness and grown into something that shaped generations. The ranch still stands today, passed down through the family, a testament to what two people can build when they find each other at exactly the right moment. And on cold December nights, when the wind howls down from the mountains and snow blankets the fields, some people say you can still see them, Sarah and Thomas, walking hand in hand through the property they loved, checking on the cattle and the horses, making sure everything is as it should be. But that is just a story, the kind that families tell to keep the past alive. The truth is simpler and more beautiful. The truth is that love, real love, the kind that is built on kindness and respect and daily choice, never really dies. It lives on in the children and grandchildren, in the values passed down, in the way families treat each other and the world around them. It lives on in journals and photographs and stories told around winter fires. It lives on in the land itself, in every fence post driven and every field planted and every season weathered. Sarah had waited in the cold for a man who never came, and in that waiting, in that disappointment and fear, she had found something so much better than what she had been looking for. She had found a partner who valued her strength as much as her softness, who challenged her to grow while accepting her exactly as she was. She had found a home that was built not on obligation or necessity, but on choice and love. She had found a family, not the one she was born into or the one she had planned for, but the one that chose her and that she chose in return. And in the end, that was everything. That was the story worth telling, the love worth having, the life worth living. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and true and deeply, profoundly meaningful. The kind of life that starts with a simple act of kindness on a cold December night and grows into a legacy that shapes the future. The leather-bound journal remains in the family, passed down to each new generation with the instruction to read it and remember. Remember where they came from. Remember the strength it takes to start over. Remember the importance of kindness to strangers. Remember that love is not always what you planned for, but that does not make it any less real or any less worth fighting for. And every December, when the snow falls on the ranch in Utah and the mountains stand silent and eternal in the distance, the family gathers to honor Sarah and Thomas and the love story that made them all possible. They read from the journal and share memories and tell the story one more time, about a woman who waited in the cold and the cowboy who offered everything he had, and how that one moment of compassion changed the trajectory of countless lives. Because that is what love does. It ripples outward like water in a pond, touching people and places far beyond its origin. It creates families and futures and possibilities that never would have existed otherwise. It transforms waiting into belonging, loneliness into connection, fear into courage. Sarah Winchester, who became Sarah Novak on a February day in 1875, understood this better than most. She had lived it, had felt the transformation in her own life, and she had spent the rest of her days trying to pay forward the gift that Thomas had given her that December night. She had taught children who had no other options. She had welcomed strangers into her home. She had built something lasting and good from the ashes of her disappointment and fear. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all. Not the ranch or the money or the land, but the proof that one person's kindness could change a life. That one moment of compassion could echo through generations. That one choice to help instead of turning away could make all the difference in the world. The story of Sarah and Thomas is not unique. Throughout history, throughout the world, there have been countless moments like theirs, countless people who chose kindness over indifference, connection over isolation. But each story is still worth telling, still worth remembering, because each one proves that we are not powerless in the face of loneliness and loss. We can choose to be the person who stops and offers help. We can choose to be the person who extends a hand to a stranger. We can choose to be the person who refuses to walk past someone in need. And maybe, just maybe, in making that choice, we will find that we are not just helping someone else. We are also finding our own way home, our own path to the love and connection and belonging we all seek. Because that is the beautiful secret at the heart of every great love story. In choosing to love another person, we also choose to become our best selves. In opening our hearts and homes to someone else, we create space for our own healing and growth. Thomas offered Sarah his coat and his home, but she gave him something equally valuable in return. She gave him purpose and partnership, laughter and love, a reason to build something meaningful instead of just going through the motions. She gave him children and grandchildren, a family to fill the empty spaces in his heart. She gave him a future worth working toward. And that is why their story matters, why it is worth telling and retelling, why the leather-bound journal is treasured and protected by every generation. Not because they were perfect, or because their love was easy, or because everything always worked out exactly as they planned, but because they chose each other, again and again, in moments both grand and mundane. Because they built something real and lasting from a foundation of kindness and respect. Because they proved that it is never too late to start over, never too late to find love, never too late to build a life worth living. The ranch still stands, The mountains still rise, and the story continues. Children are born and grow and have children of their own. The land is worked and tended and passed down. The journal is read and remembered and treasured. And somewhere in it all, the spirit of what Sarah and Thomas created together continues to thrive, a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness on a cold December night. That is the legacy. That is the story. That is the love that began when Sarah waited in the cold, but he never came, when a cowboy offered his coat and his home, and when she finally, gratefully, joyfully said yes.